Okay. Seeing Empire and Environment in Remezov's Khorograficheskaia Kniga. Well known among specialists and little known in the wider historical world, Remezov's Khorograficheskaia Kniga manifests a staggering ambition and a cartographical achievement that is no less staggering. Now, this is a horography, a description of the territory, but we commonly use the term atlas to talk about it. An atlas, meaning a book of maps or charts, also fits the bill. So I'll refer to it as atlas without. I think both terms work just fine. Um, this is not only the first atlas of Siberia, it was composed, as far as I know, before any comparable atlas of the greater Russian territory had been compiled. It was composed by Semyon Remezov. Here's a statue of him in his hometown of Tobolsk. He lived from around 1640 to sometime after 1720. I had the great pleasure of working in these archives here in Tobolsk and Tyumen to work on my first book, The Merchants of Siberia. And now I've returned to study the atlas more closely. Let me interject by just saying my intellectual agenda, I think, is defined by trying to better understand Russia's place in the early modern world. And I have started in on this second project, which is about the Dutchman, Nicholas Witsen. And I think that really exploring the connections that he had, this mover and shaker from Amsterdam and on the VOC, and this armchair cartographer, I think that studying him can illuminate important things for us about Russia's place in the early modern world. And so that has been my project. Nicholas Witsen composed one of the first maps of Eurasia that he shared with the Royal Society in London in 1687. It's here on the wall right here. This is my project. And in the course of, and in studying this, it's really taken me back to Remezov's work. And one thing I've realized is that Remezov's work is not to be glossed over. If I knew about this source. Val Kivelson has written quite a bit about this source in a number of things. Before him, Goldenberg has been a seminal source in understanding Remezov's work, as well as the other Russian historians on cartography. But as I looked to this book to try and understand how to what connections and the ways in which Witsen is drawing on Remezov, it has just drawn me deeper into this atlas in and of itself, which I think is really deserving of study. And so that's what I am engaged in now. And I'm really glad for this chance to think about empire and how we see the environment and how we see empire through it. The atlas weighs 2 pounds and 3 ounces. It comprises 176 sheets of paper. 172 of those sheets are numbered. One sheet is missing. There's 5 unnumbered pages, sometimes with titles for maps that were never drawn. And these pages come mostly at the end of the atlas. 24 of the maps have fold-out sections attached to them. The front matter comprises 9 sheets of paper with some elaborate drawings and pages of prose describing the instructions, and in an incomplete and rudimentary way, Remezov's method of doing this work. I won't focus today on the front matter, but I'll scroll through some of the pages with it, and there some of the instruments of cartography, and this manuscript map, I think, we see in it the attributions of print books, and we see the double hemispheric globe. Remezov got to work in Moscow, where he had access to an atlas by Blau, and so I think that whether we want to attribute imperial-ish aspirations to this front matter here, we certainly see a work that draws that mimics at some level European models. Although to be sure, this is by no means a work that we would squarely characterize as a work of mimicry, even if it kind of adopts some other elements. And I am going to spend the bulk of my time talking about what is in this atlas today. So the pages these pages in the front matter are done in black ink with some red embellishment. The front matter is followed by over 100 maps and one panorama on now yellowed paper. And the maps are drawn in blue, red, black, yellow swaths across many pages indicate a change in elevation and higher ground. Trees are marked throughout in what may once have been a brighter green, but has faded to a brownish olive color. And I see at least 2 tones in which trees are represented. And with one exception of a single smaller loose sheet, the sheets of paper are 30 centimeters by 20.5 centimeters. So that's 11.8 inches by 8 inches. The pages that Simeon, and I point this out because the pages that he drew on are just slightly more oblong than that of a modern standard printer paper, and with a slightly greater surface area. And the sheets have margins on all 4 sides into which the work occasionally spills over, but which subtract a bit of area on each page. So considering the modest size of this paper, the amount of detail incorporated into these maps is astounded. I actually have printed up the map on 11 by 17 paper that I sometimes use a magnifying glass to look into. And I have to remind myself, I was astounded when I understood, came to appreciate that the actual atlas itself is smaller than the pages I have reproduced for myself and use a magnifying glass on. This meticulous manuscript compilation captures Siberia in unprecedented, even intimate detail. Even as this atlas is properly seen as a monument to imperial ambition, the Khorograficheskaia Kniga simultaneously reveals the limits of that imperial ambition. This is one of the arguments I'm working towards. Those limits came in various forms, from rival powers, which I won't talk about at all today, indigenous subjects with agendas that didn't conform to imperial ambitions, and the natural world, supremely indifferent to human aspiration. The harsh climate, capricious weather, unforgiving waterways, and relentless distances constrained aspirations to tame Siberia. And looking closely at the Khorograficheskaia Kniga gives us a chance to see the environment and see empire, and maybe to be more precise, empire in process from a new vantage point. And what I want to do in this talk is appreciate with you the ways in which this atlas captures, deliberately and inadvertently, aspects of the natural world. And then I'd like to turn attention to some of the many ways that this atlas reflects the empire, again, inadvertently or advertently. And finally, I want to highlight some of the ways in which I think these maps reveal tension between the aspirations and realities of Russian imperial rule, both with respect to the human order and nature's order at the end of the turn of the 18th century. And to be sure, there'll be more about the human order than the natural order, but I'll invite discussion of all. So let me turn to nature a little bit. This atlas documents shows us a bit of the natural world. And while what I'm about to show you is more descriptive than analytical, close attention to the atlas, it's nonetheless worthwhile, is what I'd like to say. And let me show you some examples. We see many animals in this atlas, although not as many as we might. We see an image drawn of a boris, and this is taken from deep into the atlas, a fold out map of all of, Eastern Asia, not Western Asia, Eastern Asia. And up there, this is, and up here we see what is probably a snow leopard. Here is a map of their possible residence and residency, and that quite loosely conforms to what we see in the map that I just showed you. So there's one image of an animal that's shown. There aren't all that many. For the next image, we're going to move to the northern coast right up here near the mouth of the Yenisei River. There it is on Witzen's map. Here it is on a contemporary map. And here's the map I'm going to show you. And on these maps, we see images of, I think, well, we see Arctic foxes represented, and we see images of alieni represented, which I think are meaning reindeer here, reindeer in Eurasia, or caribou in North America. It's sort of one of those divisions along the lines of what's the difference between a steppe and a prairie. Steppes are in Eurasia and prairies are in North America. It's the same with reindeer and caribou is my understanding, but I'm open to suggestions. So on this map, what we see are some images of animals, and we see, I have here a picture of reindeer from the Taimyr Peninsula, and we see signs that there are processing for fox, and they're Arctic fox. And of course, as we all know, the pelts of Siberia were one of the big draws for pромышленники to go there. So we see somewhat atypical drawings of animals. We also see just textual references to animals. Up here on this circle, it says промышляет белый медведь. And here's a picture of a polar bear. And there's also in this map, we see textual indications that dogs were part of the landscape. Throughout this landscape, this atlas, it contains practical information, much travel information. If not always empirical distances are given, and there could be some variation on versts, Remezov will also often tell travelers how long it takes to get from one place to another, and also depending on how you're traveling. And so here along, it tells you how long it will take you to get to the mouth of the river if you're with sled dogs. In this map, we don't only see that, we don't only see an indication of domesticated dogs, I think. We also see an indication of wild dogs. And I didn't blow up this phrase right here, so I'll actually ask you to take my word for it, or in the discussion we could come back to it. But up here, it says that both wild dogs, ходит, пёсы, I think, ходит, and also hostile samoyeds. We'll come back to that point when we talk about the human landscape more. But so here in this map, when we read it closely, I think we see evidence, we certainly see evidence of domestic dogs and maybe less domestic dogs, along with these other animals. And the ones that are represented are animals that are farmed for their furs. And here I will show you down in this same corner, this close-up of animals. And I'm not entirely sure who these are, if they're fox or not. I'm open to suggestions. Moving around, so let's go down from the coast and let's move into the interior of Siberia, into the southern Ural Mountains, and take a look at a map that shows us the mouth of the Tobol River. Here we see two, there's a lot to say about this map, but let me just start out by pointing out to you the images of animals that we see. We see in the upper left-hand corner here, wild horses, and we also see polecats or ferrets, and represented kind of looking out over into the steppe. And this is, the location is probably higher up on the Turgai Plateau. And for me, here's kind of a research note. When I when I came to understand and that the yellow lines that come across this map indicate elevation changes, it made me realize that oh, that's what Remezov has shown us here. And I guess I should also put out for conversation that as I talk about this map, I worry that I fall into a kind of naive positivist mode sometimes, thinking and maybe taking this map at its face value. And those of us that study cartography, of course, know that we mustn't do that, because maps are human creations and they filter through what people want to see, and they often contain agenda. Entirely accepting that, and I find myself, as I explore the details of this massive atlas, still very much at that stage of trying to see what what's there, and what does it say. So maybe I'm reading it at that level. But here's one moment where, having tried to locate the geography of particular maps, and realized, oh, there's the Turgai Plateau, and oh, here's this line indicating elevation. So there is that question up there, how accurate, to what extent and where do we see verisimilitude, and where do we see Remezov just making things up? Because as we know, in early modern cartography, for sure, there was a lot of making things up. And in the front matter, we see some monsters and beasts swimming in the ocean, which is typical of maps. And there was an impulse to make things up. So it's an open question, but I think we also, that said, find an awful lot of practical information about what is out there. And I find myself thinking that he started composing these maps in the 1670s and 80s, and worked on them for years and years, astounded at the degree of information that is located in these maps. So I've deviated from my text. Let me come back to it. The animals in this map seem to be gazing out toward the barren steppe, the feature that dominates this map. Beyond, there are two lakes whose inconsistent coloring seems to indicate something perhaps more boggish than the drawn lakes to the north and the west. And the words in the top row of the grid across the center of this map, which in this projection is the south, because not all, but the majority of the maps in this atlas have south at the top of the map. And the label reads, the naked steppe, no forest, no water. In other words, let the intrepid traveler be warned. Now, so I've just shown you places in the map where I see animals drawn, and those pictures fascinate me. Overall, I would say that biodiversity revealed graphically is meager compared to what was there. We see representations of animals whose hides were harvested, or horses who were used, but not, well, yeah, we'll look at, there's other work on what's being done with all the horses that were there. One thing I noticed is that I haven't seen in the atlas yet any birds. And I note that because in all the 18th century travelers that I have read of people traveling across Siberia, Müller, Steller, Krashenikov, birds are among the first animals that they mention and observe, and they talk about huge, massive flocks of birds. So what else is in this atlas? Well, to state the obvious, which is one of the first things often said in any conversations about mapping of Siberia, we see lots of rivers and lakes. The vast networks of rivers flowing across Eurasia are well represented in these maps. And indeed, rivers are the organizing structure of the atlas itself. After the front matter, the river systems of Siberia form the organization. The Tobol River is described first in 13 pages followed by the Mias, Sinara, Nitsa, Iset rivers, and so forth. The number of pages given to a river doesn't necessarily correspond to the geographic reality. The Irtysh River, the second longest river in Siberia, gets the most amount of coverage with 33 pages. Compare that to the Lena, the longest river in Siberia, which is described in 5 maps. Perhaps not a surprise, the Lena was much less explored at that time. And the Ob River, the third largest river in Siberia, gets 14 sheets of description. The maps depict different types of water. In addition to rivers, whether it is a salt lake or a fresh lake, where there are rapids is also depicted. And in this map that I have on the screen right now, you see here, Tabulia Vada Bielaya. So I think that there he's indicating rapids. That happens at some other points in the map as well. We also see salt lakes are depicted. And of course, salt was supremely important to harvest in order to preserve food. And in the book, The Merchants of Siberia, I have a chapter about Lake Yamish, which the Russians that we know of sent an expedition there in 1594 to harvest salt, and it becomes both a market and a center of kind of contested, violent, intense trade out there on the Eurasian steppe, about halfway down the Irtysh River. So what else do we see? We see the taiga, and we see that out here pictures of the taiga. And as I look at these maps, sometimes it can be, I have to remind myself when I see these rows and rows of trees, is this the image? Is this the landscape that I want to be thinking of, be imagining? And this landscape in different seasons can appear quite different. Here is a picture of Siberian taiga. Here are some pictures of the North Coast in different seasons. And here is an indigenous encampment of the winter. This is a photograph from near Verkhoyansk, which was founded in 1638. So it existed as a place when Remezov was doing his work. And here it was on the river Yana. And here we have Verkhoyansk, represented at that time as just a small circle. I'll talk about these circles and squares in a moment. So there's kind of just a picture to think about. And this is something I'd like to better understand as well, you know, where the taiga gives way to tundra, and we're no longer looking at trees, or when we're in that zone of looking at trees that are skinny and short, but yet are quite old trees. They just don't get the chance to have all the nutrients and gentle conditions that would allow them to get taller and thicker. Now, also on this map, I want to stop right here and point out these features. Here in Remezov's map along the Lena River, I've never been there, but perhaps some of you there have visited the Lena Pillars, which have been made a UNESCO site in 2012, and it's now a national park. And so we have these pillars that stretch up over 200 meters, made largely of limestone, as well as some other types of rock in the layers, that have been standing there for hundreds of millions of years. And here we have stulbi. Oh, and my image cut it off. Now, we have these stulbi here above the river's rise. And then we also see stulbi inside the river. And again, it comes to these questions of verisimilitude. Were there pillars that stood there that have since collapsed, perhaps in some ways? And maybe this is a question that further research I can answer. I can answer with further research. I suspect that I can, I just haven't done all the work yet. Or is this a creative license? Also, just to the right on the map here, we see a place, militia, a place to pray. So an indication of some local, the local sacrality. Now, and I talked a little bit about rapids, and I want to, and as you go through these maps, they think there's a lot of other features that are pointed out that both natural or man-made. Rapids are a natural hazard that travelers would want to know about for safe travel. And another feature, man-made, that river travelers would also want to know about are, of course, portages or voloki. And these appear repeatedly throughout the atlas. I could construct, and at some point maybe I'll count them, haven't done that yet. But knowing where to portage was crucial. And it's something I'd like to better understand about Siberian travel. We know that people traveled along the river networks. Sometimes if the river was frozen in too rough of a way or wasn't frozen, or people would even travel alongside the river. Sometimes they would travel right on the smooth ice of a river. It depended. But certainly in order to get around Siberia, you would want to know where to portage. And we can infer that, where someone's portaging is where the land is lower, where it's the path of least resistance. So these human habits can point to aspects of the landscape from one sense of remove. In a similar way, throughout the atlas, we also see not everywhere, but he sometimes depicts agricultural plots. And here we can also presume that these are more fertile and conducive to planting, that the area worked. So, and then this gets us into the area of infrastructure. And this atlas, the Khorograficheskaia Kniga, is replete with all kinds of evidence of infrastructure. Maybe we call this empire in process. We see, in addition to portages, there are tracks, always represented by red dots. There are forts and bridges and fish traps and towns and churches and mosques. From some of this human infrastructure, we can infer the local geography and ecology, as I just mentioned. And here, let me come back to this map of, or let me show you. So here are some pictures, this one along the Iset River, where we see that M for most represented, and then these, I think, are more mosts. These red dotted lines, usually, I think these indicate plots of some sort. Almost always they're in black, so that's a little bit of an exception. Usually the red dotted lines are tracks and portages. Over here, this is a northern map up on the Ob River. We see a zapor, or a constriction. Is this a dam, or might this be some sort of a fish trap? I'm not entirely sure. Here's looking at some other maps. These magnifications are both taken from the same map along the Pishim River, where again we see here a bridge. We see here what may be fish traps and the settlement of the Kachengulavi cloud along the way to the Andreevsky Lakes, which is where I encountered people traveling around here in my trade records working on my book already years ago. And then, so here we see this term pirevisi, which I invite people to enlighten me as to what exactly this means. Looking it up in the dictionary, the one potentially meaningful label was a large size net for catching game. And as I look at this kind of peninsula into the water, so that's one area I'm sharing with you now, things that are questions for me to which I haven't found all the answers. But so here's but I'm sharing with you some of the infrastructure that we see depicted in this map: settlement, people living. And it isn't just Russians, it's also indigenous people are fishing rivers to eat, and sometimes to trade. Here is, again, I won't focus on this. This is the map that you'll find in the chapter of my book on Lake Yamish, and this is the Salt Lake, Lake Yamish. And here on the outside, we see some of that temporary infrastructure of a camp with weapons and forts established seasonally in order to have trade. And this trade was often accompanied by violence. Hostages would be taken, sometimes shots would be fired, and sometimes people would get hurt, as some tense trading took place along with the annual salt harvest of Russian soldiers going in, standing in the lake, and breaking up the layer of salt that formed on the bottom of the lake. Here's more of a close-up of that remarkable image. Okay, let me move on to, I don't want to talk too long. Here's another from the All-Siberian map, another image of cannons. And there are other spots where we see evidence of battle, and sometimes textual evidence of, a battle was fought here. So there's historical information that very much reflects the imperial conquest that was part of Siberia. Here's another picture that I wanted to show you, where we see traces of the human bones along a track, as well as berries that were grown. And this is a picture from just near the mouth of the Irtysh River, so upriver from Lake Yamish near Lake Zaysan, and we see evidence of humans, and we see what looks to be agricultural plots and a fort built in a somewhat atypical style. And with that, let me turn to the human landscape as that is portrayed in the atlas. And this is one of the areas that I've been working on. Forgive me that my presentation here is going to be pretty rough, but I want to show you some of the stuff that, with the terrific help of Jonathan, who counted hundreds of pages this summer, that we came up with. Now, in this, let me come back to some maps here. Human settlement is represented in various ways. We see squares and we see circles. And what I think that I've determined is that squares represent Russian settlements and circles represent indigenous or non-Russian settlements. Sometimes they're Bukharins. And they're represented, sometimes we see 1, 2, or 3, both squares or circles. I think this indicates size. And so this summer, I asked Jonathan to help me go through and count these. And what we found is where there's 1 square, 2,045 of these represented. 2 squares, 20, 3 squares, 11. And let me actually to kind of come back here and see if I can show you more clearly, right in the thick of something, what I'm talking about. Well, here, I should have had a close-up for you, but take my word for it, if you could, and I'll point it out when we see it again. So we have 2,076 Russian population points, and then counting circles using the same method, where there's 1 circle, 163, 2, 290, and 3 circles, 1,489, to bring us to just under 2,000, what I think are non-Russian population points. This method may be flawed. I have found examples of a village of squares surrounded with the label Bashkir. So it is an imperfect method, but for the most part, this atlas, one of the things that I think is remarkable about it is it functions not just as a map of a vast, vast space. It almost, when I talk about intimate detail, I'm talking about this thing functions almost like a phone book, settlement by settlement around towns, and even camp by camp sometimes up along the mouth of the Lena and Yenisei. We see the names of whose camp it is. Sometimes just pramishleniki and sometimes individual names. I have identified settlements with the last names of people that I have seen trading at the customs posts. So this is where I maybe fall into this positivistic mode that Remezov really left us a remarkable record here. And so what does counting up these things get us? And I should say, sometimes methodologically, there was a real debate. Am I seeing two squares or one square and one circle? So take these numbers not as exact, but as an approximation. Even as an approximation, I think that one of the striking things for me is the extent of the non-indigenous settlements in Siberia as well that are coexisting in this empire, is one of the kind of big takeaways that I think I see from this counting, and to be able to say it semi-empirically. Here's a map, a fold out of the, here is a fold out later in the atlas where, again, I haven't done close up, but we see squares, and then later along here you see circles. And that is at some level a measure of places where we can see coexistence or indigenous and Russians living in more proximity to each other. And again, I say this with the caveat that it's imperfect, and I've even identified flaws myself. That said, let's press forward, and I've deviated from my text a little bit, so bear with me, please, as I come back. To identify some other ways that the human geography is covered. He indicates demographic information with a variety of methods. I just talked a little bit about squares and circles. A circle with a cross on it indicates a settlement big enough to have a church or be a sloboda. And then towns, are represented with a krepist around them and are a bigger going concern. And then spread throughout are these sets of red circles and red squares, indicating what I think are population points. Now, and I think that the number of circles or squares, I'm taking that to be as indicative of the size of the settlement, bigger settlement, smaller settlement in terms of extended families. For example, even there's a red square on the outside of Tobolsk marked Remezov. And that's what I mean when I say this chorography doubles as a phone book almost, which is really remarkable when we consider what an imprecise affair the 17th century mapping could be. And even that the post didn't go house to house. I've encountered notes saying, please deliver this letter wherever you may find him. But nonetheless, there is a way of getting things to people, and they are keeping track of, there's a degree of keeping track. So to not belabor this too much, I want to get to this one point that I think I see. This information about human geography, the human geography of Siberia, also reveals something of the limits of sovereignty. Remezov's maps provide signs that the state did not exercise full sovereignty over all the people in the Eurasian territory it claimed. He does this explicitly with a particular symbol, I think. I think he does it with this symbol, the tent. Throughout the atlas, there are almost 200 of these tents. And I think that when the way I have started to understand it, and I am open to input, but when I see this tent, I think that I'm seeing an entity that is recognized as having some sort of sovereignty amongst itself. On the maps of the steppe, where Russian presence was tenuous, we see these tents more frequently. To be sure, the limits of his choreography do not stop at the extent of Russian sovereignty. Remezov maps, albeit on a much larger scale, the great cities of Bukhara and Khiva in Central Asia and Beijing in China. And while in the 19th century, the Russian Empire would conquer that territory of Central Asia, and even given that Remezov was an unabashed booster for Russian imperialism, the function here conforms to this, as I see it, a more practical mandate of providing information for would-be travelers than necessarily an imperial aspiration. That's kind of in thinking about what is going on, where we see places that Russia has not claimed yet represented in this choreography. I think there's a very practical component to it, if not exclusively. But coming back to the territory, of course, one motive doesn't exclude the other. And leaving aside the issue of an aspirational imperialism that may be embedded in marking distant territories in this Siberian atlas, the use of a tent to identify Samoyeds near the west shore of the Ob River, and this little inset that I am showing you right here on the screen is from the near the Ob River, so more in Western Siberia. I started to think when I first saw those tents, I thought that they represented kind of steppe living, some sort of yurt. But then recognizing that this tent is up near the mouth of the Ob River started to say to me, there might be something else going on here. And that's helped me arrive at this idea that I think it indicates some sort of recognition of people that don't acquiesce or ascribe themselves to be subordinate to the Russian Tsar. This is, of course, open for discussion. But so we see a tent to identify Samoyeds near the west shore of the Ob River. And that suggests to me a group that Remezov recognized as having a status somewhat different than the subject in relation to the Russian Tsar. It makes it all the more interesting that across the Ob River on the east bank, we see a town, and we might think it was a Russian town, except that upon closer examination, we notice that there is no cross indicated in the jumbled and architectural outlines. The red ink may itself be an indicator. And to my knowledge, Russian towns, not the settlements indicated just by squares, Russian towns that are bigger enough to have a krepist are generally drawn in black, not red. And the words labeling the town further reveal the lifeways of these Arctic inhabitants. So the label on this town, which I'm not showing you a picture of right now, I apologize, is this. It says, town with Ob Samoyeds. They spring and fall near here. And they spring and fall here. I love that. Osnuit I visnuit, using the seasons as a verb. They spring and fall near here, near the fish. Why Remezov chose to represent Samoyeds with tents on one side and with a town-like symbol on the other side is not entirely clear, but based on his use of symbols throughout the atlas, I suspect that the distinction is meaningful and that it might have something to do with how he understood these people to see themselves in relation to the Russian Tsar. And here, let me repeat, I apologize that I didn't show you this example of the Ob coast, but let me show you a different example where I think that the same thing is going on. This is coming back to an inset of the mouth of the Yenisei River. And what we have on the west coast up here is, so I think what we see, and anyone that can read this script better than me, please don't be shy about correcting me. But I think what I'm reading here is Rechka heta nij по ней пес ходит. So I think that's where kind of dogs roam, and I think it's saying wild dogs. And maybe Дурацкая самоед немирный через Taz. So then the Taz River is up here somewhere. So here we have identified самоед немирный, hostile самоеды. Here on the other side of the river, we see these three circles. And here, живут, ясочная самоед. So here are samoyeds that pay tribute to the Tsar. And so on the Ob River, we have another example of that, where Remezov, so I think what's going on in these maps is we are seeing, even in this geography that the Russian Empire has claimed, we are seeing Remezov acknowledging that some people are more subordinate than other people. And I think that two of the ways that we see indications of unsubordinate people are defying them as nimirni, or in other places we see these people don't pay yisak. And then also back to this image of a tent, which I think is his way of indicating indigenous people that show a greater degree of sovereignty.
Erika, I'm sorry, we are running a little bit out of time.
And I'm done. Yeah, with that, I apologize for going over. I'll stop there and thank you for your attention and listening as I shared some of the fascinating things that I'm seeing in this atlas.